I've always heard of people trash Resident Evil Gaiden. People make fun of it, talk about it like it's a joke. But if you actually stop and look at it for what it is, a Game Boy Color game, there's some pretty cool ideas in here. A unique combat system, and even resource management. I would have loved to have had this as a kid. But, what was Resident Evil Gaiden? This game makes way more sense when you stop trying to treat it like it was supposed to be a normal Resident Evil game. Because this wasn't Capcom sitting down and saying, alright, let's make the next big Resident Evil title. This was Capcom trying to answer a different question. Can Resident Evil survive on a handheld? And this is early 2000s handheld, a Game Boy Color. The tiny screen, the cartridges, just really limited hardware. This genre wasn't really built for handheld gaming at the time. Handhelds were built around things you could pick up and play in short bursts. It had to work on hardware that wasn't meant to carry atmosphere the way a PlayStation could. And what it started out as is kind of wild. The original idea was to just port the original game. There was a separate Resident Evil project being made for the Game Boy Color that ended up getting cancelled, and a lot of reports show that it came very close to being finished. That's important because it says a lot about the reality of that era. Even when they got close, that kind of port could still feel wrong. Resident Evil 1 on this kind of hardware just would not feel like Resident Evil. So instead of forcing a straight port, Gaiden became the pivot. It's Capcom stepping back and saying, okay, let's build something from the ground up that actually fits the system. And the way Gaiden came together is honestly weirder than most people probably realize. A lot of the heavy lifting here was done by a small British studio called M4. It wasn't a big internal Capcom team. Their European publisher, Virgin Interactive, had commissioned them to put together a handheld proof of concept, and that demo impressed Capcom enough that they turned it into a full project. So Gaiden comes from a really specific place. It's a mix of Capcom wanting a handheld Resident Evil that actually worked, and a smaller outside team trying to prove that they could make that happen. And you can really feel that intent in the choices Gaiden makes. The goal here was to take the identity of Resident Evil, the exploration, the resource management, that creeping sense of danger, and find a form of it that could live on hardware like this. And the timing makes it even more interesting. The Game Boy Advance had launched in early 2001, and by that point, a new generation of handheld hardware was already showing up. Gaiden still shipped on the Game Boy Color though, landing late in that system's life. It ends up feeling like one of those end-of-an-era experiments, a moment where developers were still pushing older hardware to see what else they could pull off before moving on. That's the mindset you have to bring into this. Because once you frame Gaiden as an experiment, once you frame it as Resident Evil under extreme limitations, the whole conversation around the game changes. It stops being, why is this game weird? And it starts being, how did they even make this work? And that's the question that really grounds everything that follows this. Once you spend some time with the game, the way it plays really starts to make sense. The mechanics start to layer in, and they just settle as you move through the ship and get a feel for how the game wants you to play it. Exploration is handled from a top-down view, and after a bit, it really does start to feel natural. You're moving through hallways, rooms, stairwells, and these tight spaces that slowly map themselves out in your head. The ship isn't huge, but it's structured enough that you start to remember where things are. I thought it was really cool. It reminded me of memorizing the mansion from the first game. That layout sticks with you the more you spend time in it, and that familiarity starts to guide how you move through the ship. If a path gets blocked off, you already have 3 different routes memorized to get to your destination. There's a rhythm to navigating that space. You're checking the doors, noticing icons, watching for items or zombies nearby. You never really feel rushed, but you also never really feel relaxed. The game gives you just enough information to keep you moving forward, and the rest comes from paying attention and remembering what you've already seen. And over time, the map starts to make sense, and moving around feels more intentional instead of confusing. The combat works in a similar way. It feels really strange at first, but after a couple of fights, you understand what the game's asking of you. When enemies show up, everything narrows, it goes into first person, the screen changes, and you're locked into a moment where timing matters more than anything else. You're watching the gauge move back and forth, and you have to commit to your attacks at the right moment. If you mistime it, you can miss your shot and just burn through your ammo. And the catch with that is, if you use a stronger weapon, the gauge moves faster, making it a lot easier to accidentally waste your good ammo. That creates its own kind of tension. You start thinking about fights before they happen. You think about what you're carrying, how much health you have left, and whether it's even worth engaging. Ammo stops feeling like something you can just casually burn through. The knife starts feeling more important than it ever has. Every encounter feels like a decision you're making on purpose. The inventory feeds into that feeling too. You're not rearranging items or fighting for space like you would in the original games, but everything you pick up still matters. Keys open progress, weapons change how safe you feel moving forward, healing items give you a little breathing room. You're always aware of what you have access to and how that affects the next stretch of exploration. The way saving works reinforces that also. You're not constantly locking things in, so moving deeper into the ship feels like a commitment. Your mistakes don't immediately disappear, progress builds slowly. And when you make it through a stretch cleanly, it feels earned. As all that comes together, the mechanics start feeling deliberate. The game focuses on a small set of interactions and lets them carry the experience. Move carefully, pay attention, manage what you have, and learn the space. After a while, Gaiden starts to feel coherent in its own way. It may not be flashy or loud or cinematic like the other games, but it's focused. The mechanics support each other, and they keep you in a steady state of awareness as you move through the ship. That's when the game really works, because it keeps survival at the center of the experience, even in a smaller form. Once all that settles in, Gaiden stops feeling like the joke everyone makes it out to be, and it starts to feel like its own interpretation of what Resident Evil can be. Hey, just real quick, if you've made it this far, thank you. I really appreciate y'all hanging out with me for a little bit. If you're enjoying the video, consider subbing. We're getting really close to 10,000 subs, and the goal is to hit that before the new year. I don't know if we'll quite get there, but we're going to be really close, and that's honestly insane. Also, drop a like and leave a comment. Let me know if you ever played Gaiden, if you've only heard stories about it, or if seeing it here makes it look more interesting than you expected. I love hearing y'all's thoughts on these games. And for anyone watching on mobile, consider hitting the hype button. It gives the video hype points and helps tell the algorithm, hey, this video is worth watching. More people should see it. It's a way that you can directly help grow the video. And we're also just a couple of days away from the 1-year mark for the channel. And again, it's just been insane. I never expected this to grow the way it has, especially for a retro game channel. Hitting almost 10,000 subs in a year still just doesn't feel real to me. So seriously, thank you. That's enough of that. Let's get back into Gaiden and talk about what works and what doesn't really carry over. Even though this is a Game Boy game, it still does build tension, and it starts showing up in a very specific way. It builds as you move back and forth through the ship and slowly realize how much of your survival depends on what you're carrying and how far you still have to go. Resources sit at the center of that feeling. Ammo matters here in a way that you feel almost immediately. It's similar to the other Resident Evils, but a bit different. The different zombie types take different amounts of punishment, and you learn that pretty quickly. Some enemies soak up shots, others drop faster. That alone starts shaping how you approach encounters. You just start thinking about which fights are worth the cost. Because of that, the knife ends up doing a lot of the work for a good portion of the game. I use the knife in this more than I have in any other Resident Evil. It really becomes your default weapon. Saving ammo early starts to feel important once you realize there are enemies later on that can hit you from a distance. Those encounters stick with you. Swinging at empty space while waiting for an enemy to move closer, knowing you can't afford to waste bullets. It creates a kind of pressure that sits with you after the fight ends. That pressure grows as backtracking becomes part of the rhythm. You're running from one end of the ship to the other, sometimes more than once, tracking down keys and specific items you need to move forward. The layout starts to feel familiar, but that familiarity doesn't remove the risk. Moving through the same hallways again and again starts to feel heavier when your health is low and your inventory's thin. Finding items plays into that experience as well. Nothing sparkles or calls attention to itself like the items do in the other games. So you end up hugging walls and checking corners and moving slowly, waiting for that small notification that tells you something's there. Exploration becomes deliberate. Every stretch of movement feels like a choice, especially when you're passing through areas full of zombies you don't have the resources to deal with. Running those same paths with no ammo or healing items is where some of the stronger moments land. Each trip across the ship feels like a small gamble, and that sense of risk stays consistent the longer you play. Atmosphere holds up in a very specific way in this. The zombies are almost always visible. You get clear notifications when enemies aggro. The game keeps you informed about what's around you, and that awareness becomes part of the tension. You're rarely surprised, but you're almost always planning ahead. The game also leaves a lot of space for your imagination to do some of the work. A lot of the cutscenes rely on still images or just very simple animations. They don't linger or spell everything out, so when things get violent or unsettling, your mind fills in the gaps. Those moments end up feeling harsher than the visuals suggest, simply because you're left to finish them yourself. That same restraint carries through the rest of the experience. The ship is compact, encounters are direct, the presentation stays stripped down. You're asked to meet the game halfway, and when you do, certain moments land harder than you might expect. Sound plays a smaller role in shaping that experience. The music sets a tone and stays memorable, but most of the tension comes from what you see and manage rather than what you hear. Enemies announce themselves clearly. Danger is readable. Pressure comes from movement, distance, and resource management, opposed to the usual atmosphere and sound design. Taken as a whole, the experience feels consistent. The systems reinforce survival through repetition and pressure. The presentation leaves room for interpretation, and the boundaries of the game are always present, and everything operates inside them. What stays with Gaiden is the feeling of moving through a familiar space while slowly running out of options. It's this quiet buildup of stress, knowing that the next mistake might cost you a good chunk of your progress. That's the shape of the experience here, and the edges you feel along the way don't pull it apart. They define what this version of the game is able to hold. Once you understand how the game plays, the story starts to fall into place pretty naturally. It's smaller, it's more contained, it's very focused on a single incident, and that actually works in its favor. The entire game takes place aboard a luxury cruise ship called the Starlight, and from the start, that setting does a lot of heavy lifting. The ship is isolated out at sea, which immediately cuts off outside help and limits the scope for what the story can be. You don't bounce around set pieces or facilities here. Everything happens inside one location and it slowly turns into a disaster zone. It's similar to how Dead Aim starts out, but Dead Aim you kind of get off the ship halfway through the game. Leon is sent in to investigate after a distress signal goes out, and pretty quickly it becomes clear that Umbrella's involved. Something biological is being transported on the ship, and containment has already failed. Passengers and crew begin turning, and the ship itself becomes a closed loop of corridors, cabins, and engine rooms that you have to push through as the situation escalates. As you move through the story, you learn that the outbreak isn't just another standard virus scenario. At the center of it is a parasite-based biological weapon, Lucia. One of the survivors you encounter. She's directly tied to that experiment. She's carrying a parasite. And Umbrella's goal isn't just damage control here. They want the organism recovered. That parasite angle is what gives Gaiden's story its identity. Because the threat here is not static, it grows, it mutates, it develops over time. And the story keeps circling back to that idea. The parasite has stages, and those stages shape the boss you encounter and the direction the narrative takes. Because in this one you're watching an experiment progress as you move through the ship. Barry Burton, one of the most underrated characters in the series in my opinion, starts the game out, giving Leon a partner and fans of the first game a cool character to see again. His presence doesn't expand the scope though. It reinforces the idea that this is still a tight operation focused on containment and survival rather than a broader conspiracy. What's interesting about all this is how early it feels in the series. Exploration of parasites. Gaiden doesn't treat that concept as fully defined or deeply explained. It's more like a test run. A story asking what happens when infection isn't just something you catch, it's something that lives, grows, and changes inside a host. The game doesn't over-explain it. It lets the idea exist and carry the plot forward on its own. The way the story is told matches that scale. The cutscenes are short and often presented through still images and just simple animations. The dialogue is usually brief, and the information is delivered in small pieces between gameplay. The game doesn't linger on spectacle or dramatic framing here. It gives you enough to understand what's happening and then pushes you back into the ship. That restraint ends up helping the story. When things turn violent or unsettling, the lack of detailed visuals leaves space for your imagination to fill in the gaps. Moments involving the parasite and its effect feel more disturbing because you're piecing them together yourself rather than watching a long cinematic spell everything out. By the time you reach the end, the story has done what it set out to do. You've seen the experiment unfold, the outbreak spread, and the threat reach its final form. Leon and Barry stop Umbrella's plan and escape the ship, closing the loop of this specific incident, although there's some questionable things that happen with Leon at the end. But the story doesn't try to reshape the series or establish new long-term lore. It exists as a contained event, a side story that explores an idea, plays it out, and then ends. That's why it fits so well here. The narrative never stretches beyond what the game can support. Everything stays grounded in the same space you're moving through and the threat you're dealing with. In that sense, Gaiden's story mirrors the rest of the game. It's compact, focused, and experimental. It takes familiar Resident Evil themes, the isolation, biological horror, corporate experimentation, and compresses them down to fit a smaller stage. And within that space, it tells a complete story that feels intentional rather than underdeveloped. To understand why Gaiden was left behind, you have to step outside the game itself and look at the expectations surrounding it. This happens a lot with some of the lesser loved Resident Evil titles. People walk in with a very specific idea of what a Resident Evil game is supposed to be, and anything that doesn't match that image tends to get dismissed early. Gaiden fell straight into that trap. At the end of the day, this is a Game Boy Color game. That fact matters more than people like to admit. Handheld games at the time lived under completely different rules. The screen size, sound, memory, controls, all of it shaped what was possible. Judging a game built for that hardware against full PlayStation releases was never going to be a fair comparison. There was no version of this where Gaiden could live up to those expectations. A lot of early reactions treated it like a watered-down Resident Evil instead of a game designed specifically for a portable format. Mechanics were labeled as strange instead of intentional. Presentation was seen as lacking instead of scaled. The conversation never really slowed down long enough to ask what the game was trying to do on its own terms. Handheld design itself was still widely misunderstood. Portable games were often expected to feel like smaller copies of console titles, even when the hardware simply could not support that approach. Gaiden didn't try to force that. It built around limitations and accepted the space it lived in. That choice shaped everything about it. And it's also the reason it was so easy to dismiss. Some of Gaiden's ideas do live on. The series would eventually return to Parasite-focused stories in a much bigger way, and handheld Resident Evil would come back years later also. Games like Revelations proved that mobile-first Resident Evil could exist. But those games arrived in a very different era, on very different hardware, and with very different expectations. None of that retroactively changed how Gaiden was treated at the time though. Gaiden itself never got a follow-up. Its specific approach to survival, its compact storytelling, and its take on what Resident Evil could look like on truly limited hardware all ended right there. There was no second attempt to refine it, no chance for the idea to evolve. Without that continuation, the game stayed isolated. Timing played a role too. The series was moving fast, attention was focused on bigger releases, and Gaiden just arrived quietly in the background. It didn't redefine anything, and because of that, it was easy to overlook, and over time it became easier to joke about than revisit. What sticks with me is that Gaiden wasn't ignored because it didn't care, or because it misunderstood the series. It was ignored because it was never given the chance to be looked at fairly. It existed in a narrow lane, and it was judged as if it was competing in a completely different one. Gaiden didn't fail at being a Resident Evil. It was never allowed to be what it actually was. So many of these games that get crapped on all the time is because the right expectations don't get set. If you just try to play these games with an open mind, and go into them for what they're trying to be and not so much what you want them to be, I really think you'll enjoy a lot more games. It really helps when you're not comparing every game to everything else. Just take it for its own thing, and have fun. When you really take a step back and look at Gaiden as a whole, what it ends up proving is kind of simple. Resident Evil is more flexible than people usually give it credit for. Gaiden takes the core ideas of the series and compresses them down as far as they can reasonably go. Isolation, resource management, slow movement through hostile spaces. A biological threat that keeps evolving. None of that disappears here, it just exists inside a smaller frame. The game shows that survival horror doesn't rely on cinematic cameras or big set pieces to function. It relies on tension that builds over time, on decisions that matter because you can't undo them easily, on spaces you learn, remember, and move through carefully because the cost of mistakes follows you. Gaiden was never trying to replace the mainline games. It wasn't trying to redefine the series or push it in a new direction. It was just asking a narrower question. How much of Resident Evil can still live inside a truly limited space? And the answer turns out to be more than most people expected. It proves the series can survive extreme reduction. It proves that tone can exist without spectacle. It proves that tension can come from systems and structure, not just presentation. Even the Parasite story here shows that Resident Evil was already experimenting with ideas that would later become central to the franchise. This game was never meant to be the future of Resident Evil, but it never needed to be. It's a boundary marker, an experiment that shows where the edges are and how far the series can bend without breaking. Seen that way, it stops feeling like a joke or a curiosity. It feels like an honest attempt to explore what the series is made of, and that's really all it needed to be. But if you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I really appreciate you hanging out with me for a bit and spending some time here with this one. This one was a bit different. I've not covered a game like this before, so I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you did, consider subbing if you're not already. Drop a like if it helped change how you see the game, and leave a comment letting me know what you thought of Gaiden, whether you've played it before or this was your first time seeing it. But, as always, I'll see y'all later.